Welcome to a special episode of the CEC Report. Japanese banking expert and too big to fail and too big to jail. This special episode of the CEC Report is going to feature an interview done by Executive Intelligence Review magazine in the United States in early October with a Japanese banking expert named Daisuke Kotegawa, who is a good friend of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. I had the honour of travelling with Daisuke in March 2014 to Canberra. We spent a couple of days there meeting federal members of parliament to promote the urgent need for Glass-Steagall, which is the separation of investment banking from commercial banking, right? Without which, as you know, Jeremy, we're going to have a total, the financial system crisis that began in 2008 hasn't been resolved because it didn't go down this path.
We're going to take the speculation out of the whole financial system, separate the two forms of commercial versus investment banking. We can't afford any gambling. We need the money to get back into the real substance of the economy and infrastructure and so forth.
Exactly. Now, Daisuke Kotegawa, the word expert is often used loosely. He is a genuine expert. He is the former Deputy Director of the Ministry of Finance in Japan, and he's also the former Director for Japan at the International Monetary Fund. He's a huge champion of Glass-Steagall for the world, and one of the reasons he is because this gentleman successfully managed and resolved the financial crisis in Japan in 1999. It was a crisis caused by the Japanese banks gambling in derivatives. Japanese banks and life insurance companies, actually, they gambled in derivatives and they lost big time. And the derivatives were sold to them by Wall Street banks, right? So what Daisuke had to do was lead a team of people who went into the Japanese banks and cleaned them up. The first thing he did, Jeremy, was over the course of a weekend, he cancelled all their derivatives, wound them up, so that it stopped the Japanese crisis becoming a global crisis. That's the first thing he did. The second thing he did was, apart from cancelling them, they actually put the bankers involved in jail. And some of these bankers were his friends because they moved in similar circles. He was a regulator, etc. But some of them were his friends. And he's going to talk about that in this interview, right? So let's have a look at Daisuke Kotegawa in this interview with Michael Billington, where he elaborates on the need for Glass-Steagall and putting bankers who've been caused these kind of crises through their criminal activity in jail.
Well, basically, people in charge in 2008, in the case of Lehman shock, they were successful in stopping this crisis from becoming something like Great Depression in 1929. But they made some substantial mistakes, which we didn't do back in Japan in late 1990s. The most important thing is the authorities didn't arrest anybody among bankers who were responsible for this big problem. And from our experience in Japan, we know that bankers just repeat wrongdoing again and again, which would give them a big profits. And so the only way we can stop them is to get rid of those people.
Which has not happened at all in the United States. Many people were arrested in Japan and none here. Do you want to say something about the failure to restore Glass-Steagall and the failure of the Dodd-Frank bill to deal with this problem?
Oh yes, the largest problem now we have is due to the abolishment of the Glass-Steagall. Now, investment bankers can get involved in huge amount of a kind of gamble using the ordinary people's money in their deposits. These deposits are very, very important for the ordinary people. So the government cannot disdain these ordinary people's deposits. That's why the government has to maintain this kind of basic financial system. So there's no other option for the governments to bail those banks out in order to maintain those ordinary people's deposits. So basically, what happened in the past is investment bankers, they actually privatized their own profits while they nationalized the losses and socialized their risk.
Very well, interesting formulation. The Mr. Kotegawa is here in Washington because the IMF is having its annual conference, its annual summit here in Washington this weekend. Do you think that the IMF is going to be discussing any competent solutions, or do you think they're spinning their wheels trying to find some way of bailing out the current disaster?
I hope they are, but I'm afraid they would not, because basically IMF is Europe-centered institution, and they don't want to get this kind of problem exposed to the entire world. So my big concern is IMF cannot do anything.
Welcome back to this special episode of the CEC Report. Japanese banking expert and too big to fail and too big to jail. So continuing our interview with Daisuke Kotegawa, the former Deputy Director of the Ministry of Finance in Japan, he now explains a specific proposal he has to resolve the Deutsche Bank crisis. And we're going to put up on the screen before we get back to the interview the graphic produced by the International Monetary Fund in July, which shows how Deutsche Bank is actually at the center of a global web that connects it to every other too big to fail bank in the world. And Deutsche Bank is one of the world's biggest derivatives banks, which Daisuke is an expert in. If it collapses, it will set off a chain reaction to this whole mess. So listen to Daisuke talk about what should be done in the case of Deutsche Bank, and specifically listen to the fact that how he blames the Deutsche Bank crisis not on Germany, which nominally owns the bank, but on London and Wall Street.
Well, yes, we have the way out, but before doing that, we need, two conditions. And that is, number one is the reintroduction of Glass-Steagall, so that this kind of mistakes will not be repeated. That's number one. And number two is the people who are responsible for this kind of crisis should be punished. So on those other conditions, we have to control this kind of a big crisis, and this would require a very extensive cooperation of banking supervisory authorities of all countries where the counterparties of Deutsche Bank are headquartered. So the first thing this group have to do is to set secretly X day when they actually settle all of these derivatives, and then that will come down to the specific amount for each bank to be bailed out. And so all all governments have to be ready to supply that I think required amount of money to bail out those banks.
On the condition that they implement the preconditions you mentioned, the Glass-Steagall and the arrest of the criminal responsible. You have indicated that there's no solution to Deutsche Bank outside of those conditions, but that it has to be nationalized, that the German government has to give confidence back to the bank by putting the state behind it. How would that function?
Well,
and do you think it will happen?
Banking sector is different from manufacturing sector. Even in manufacturing sector, it takes time for any manufacturing company to become insolvent. For example, 5 to I think 10 years. But banking sector is basically a virtual world where the confidence in the system and also in specific bank is very important. So it is very important to make announcement by the German government that German government would be standing right behind this bank. So the best way would be for the German for the government Germany to announce that it will partially nationalize this Deutsche Bank and just ensure that this bank will not collapse.
Do you have any expectation that the German government's going to do that?
This will be a big political issue, which I don't know whether they are prepared to do, because the main reason is this big problem was created by the London branch of Deutsche Bank, where most of the employees are either British or American, and Germans are not involved. So when I visited Germany last June, I found that there is so much disinterest in rescuing, Deutsche Bank, and rather other people said that let that bank collapse.
And the impact of that, however, on the German economy would be devastating.
No, German economy is fairly healthy compared with other countries in Europe. But if Deutsche Bank will collapse without any control, that will have, tremendous contagion effect on other major banks in Europe. I just refrain from specifying the name of those banks, but I should say that about 10 to 15 major banks in Europe, all of them would become insolvent and disappear.
Mm-hmm. Mr. LaRouche's proposal, which is very similar to yours, uses as a reference the former CEO of Deutsche Bank, Mr. Herrhausen. How do you see the difference between Deutsche Bank as it functioned under the Herrhausen administration and previous to that, and how it has since that time?
Well, that's if I put it in a very simple way, that's the difference between commercial bank and investment bank. Investment bank does not create anything for ordinary, consumers. While at commercial banks, they do not create huge amount of profits for their banks, but they play a very important role to enhance the industries in certain countries. So in that sense, I think commercial banks are very important for national economy and also for ordinary depositors.
Now, at this point, Mr. Kotegawa emphasizes that unless these bankers who've caused this mess are jailed, they will continue their practices that have bankrupted the world.
Well, I was in charge of the investigation of those failed financial institutions back in Japan, and I found that those people who had worked in banks, they didn't have any loyalty to their own banks, nor did they have any loyalty to their nations. Their interest was just for their own personal interest. And unlike people's imagination, they are not smart people. Once they have a very good, I think, opportunity to have made fortunes in their banking, then they really like to repeat it. So unless anybody in our, I think, authorities stop them, it is highly likely that they just repeat, and the government has to bail them out again and again, as long as I think commercial banking is linked with, I think, investment banking. So I think Japanese, not I think US, I think US, I think US citizen, but I had a chance to watch a very famous movie about, I think, Bonnie and Clyde.
Bonnie and Clyde.
And they robbed certain amount of money by, I think, attacking banks, but the money lost from this, I think, big crisis cannot compare with the I think, scale of the money which Bonnie and Clyde robbed, and that, I think, they were shot dead, while people who are, I think, responsible, they were not even put in the jail.
Yeah, yeah.
Welcome back to this special episode of the CEC Report. Japanese banking expert and too big to fail and too big to jail. So finally, Michael Billington asks Mr. Kotegawa a question from the standpoint of the American economy, which is also true of the Australian economy. Shouldn't we, as economies, participate in the China-led infrastructure investment program? And in response, Mr. Kotegawa describes the state of US infrastructure, which is a description that incidentally explains why Donald Trump has just won the US presidential election.
The United States generally gave up on investing in infrastructure in the rest of the world, or actually even within the United States. The argument being that this is better left to the private sector. The result seems to be that while the BRICS-centered nations, the new Silk Road countries, are investing in huge infrastructure projects across Asia, South America, Africa, the US and European industries are very little involved in that process. How can we get the tremendous opportunity to the Western industries to recognize that this would be to their benefit as well as the benefit of the rest of the world?
Well, to be very frank, I see there are very, I think, small space left out for the improvement in infrastructure, both in Japan and also in Europe. But that is not the case here in the United States. I must say that highway system or railroad system here in the States is inferior to their counterparties in China. China has much better than railroad. They have much better highways, and this kind of infrastructure can contribute a lot to the national economy, and I think. Let me give you a very simple example. Between Washington, D.C. and New York, now it takes 3 hours by the train. I think, super express. The distance of these, I think, two cities is equal to the distance between Tokyo and Nagoya. And with the I think Shinkansen, it takes only 1 hour and a half between Tokyo and Nagoya, while here it takes, I think, 3 hours. And in addition to that, between Tokyo and Nagoya, we have those bullet trains every 7 minutes. Every 7 minutes with 18 wagons, and each wagon can carry 100 people. So apparently, if I think United States would have this kind of bullet train system, that would enhance the economic growth here in the States. And of course, and you have the argument that some area can be left to the private sector. Well, that may be true, but that kind of argument was used by certain group of people just to make them rich. Yeah, for example, I was really annoyed to have found that new apartments, I think, around this area.
In Washington.
In Washington, they have the special, I think, power machine in case there's blackout. While the old house where I lived for 3 years, they don't have any of those. That means houses which were built before 2000, the year of I think 2000, they didn't have a risk of the blackout. While after 2000, after you actually privatized some part of your power system, well, you started to have to expect blackouts. This is really sad.
So Jeremy, those are the views of Daisuke Kotegawa, who, like I said, is a real expert. Where can viewers get more information on Glass-Steagall?
Call in, you'll see the number on our screen, and get a copy of Glass-Steagall now. This tells you all about Glass-Steagall and why we need it, why it's so important to break up the big banks. And also get a copy of our Australian Alert Service. Call in to get a free copy of this. This gives you a weekly update of what's really going on in the real world that you won't get from the mainstream media.
Thanks, Jeremy. And the other thing I'll mention is that a week or so ago, the CEC launched a petition calling for Glass-Steagall for Australia. It's available on our website. Look at that petition. We're distributing it right around Australia. Help us in that process. Sign it yourself, get names on it, and that will help put this issue at the forefront of the political agenda in Australia. As part of that, it's in our latest New Citizen newspaper that the CEC has produced, which you can also ask for if you call in for a copy. That explains the latest stage of the crisis and how Glass-Steagall is so important, and also it exposes who the City of London is, which is the main obstacle to this. But that's it for this special episode of the CEC Report. Thanks for watching, and watch next week for more of the CEC Report.